Policies and procedures are tied very directly to your role and responsibilities. Policies are the position of the organization. It's generally what you can or cannot do. Procedures, if you think about it in simplistic terms, are the how something should be done. So it is your responsibility to know these policies and procedures. And again, these procedures and policies are based on laws and regulations, but also specifics of the facility in which you work. Policies protect both you and your patient, and they're outlined in specific statements. Let me give you a few examples. No bad-mouthing of other staff. That would be an example of a policy. It's an expectation that everybody is asked to adhere to. Some other examples of policies, maybe there's policies that are in place that encourage staff to assist new staff in feeling welcome. Again, that would be important. Complaining, perhaps there's policies in place within your facility that curb complaining. And it's your responsibility to go either to someone that can help you or to bite your tongue when we talk about complaining, because it happens in the workplace. Bottom line is preserving your right to a supportive work environment. And policies and procedures do just that. Procedures, in contrast to policies, as I mentioned before, specify how you do something, how actions are carried out. And they're developed not because everyone wants you to do things exactly the same as them, but because the outcome, the end result, is dependent on the how you do it. Your facility, for example, may have a procedure with regard to call-ins, and procedures set then the expectations for all. With the example of call-ins, perhaps everyone has to call in within 4 hours before the start of their shift. You can imagine what would happen if there wasn't a procedure around how to go about a call-in. And if you think about it, procedures also protect your rights. In the case I just gave you, the example of call-ins, they protect your right for adequate staffing. So it's important and it does benefit you, but it's your right to know policies and procedures and also your responsibility to follow them. Why? As I've mentioned before, consistency of quality of care. If everyone's using similar tools, they can respond in a similar way. Secondly, a benefit of policies and procedures is safety of the patients and safety of the staff. Injuries can occur. For example, if you're not following the proper procedure for lifting, it can result in an injury to one of the staff members. So when you are employed, it's your right to know the policies and procedures. It is your right to know what is expected of you and then to follow them. Finally, I can't stress something that a lot of caregivers fail to ask about during the orientation. And this, again, is your right and your responsibility, a performance appraisal. You have the right and the responsibility to find out how you're doing and to get feedback from your supervisor. Keep in mind that performance appraisals are oftentimes tied to your raises. So usually you do receive a performance appraisal after your training period and then on an annual time frame, yearly, usually at your anniversary. And it's your right and responsibility to ask for this. It's also important, however, to look at feedback not only during that once-a-year performance appraisal time, but ongoing. Feel free to go to your supervisor and say, how am I doing? You should be working with your supervisor to make sure you're doing what's expected of you. In addition to your role and responsibilities, one of your rights is to a physically safe work environment. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, put together the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And OSHA is responsible for putting together regulations, policies, and procedures that protect you. They address things like physical hazards. For example, the Federal Hazard Communication Standard was enacted in 1983 to take an approach to chemicals and for staff and employees to know about chemicals within the workplace and the precautions they need to take when they're working with the chemicals. You may have heard of a Right to Know program, and that's oftentimes what you'll find in your facility it's called. And the Right to Know program requires employers who use hazardous chemicals to prepare an inventory and to put together some training information sheets on those specific chemicals, then to train you on those chemicals so that they're labeled, so you understand, so all the pieces are in place so that hazards are being communicated to you. Your facility has information on chemicals being used in their facility. It's important for you to ask for that. Oftentimes in the orientation period, the facility will review that with you. Bloodborne pathogens is also something I'd like to spend a moment talking about. As you know, we work in healthcare, and in healthcare there are a lot of exposure issues. In fact, 5.6 million workers in healthcare are at risk of occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens. HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. Those are some examples of bloodborne pathogens, or things that can be carried through fluids. And the bloodborne pathogen standard addresses this issue. The ultimate goal of OSHA's bloodborne pathogen standard is to protect all workers from occupationally acquired bloodborne infections. This policy requires employers to conduct a job hazard analysis and to document policies and procedures that may be associated with a potential risk. You may have heard of the SHARPS program, and oftentimes within facilities they'll spend a lot of time talking about the SHARPS program. That's an excellent example. It's the Needle Stick Safety Program, the SHARPS program. Your facility will have specific policies and procedures around needle handling, and training will cover that so that you can be safe, so you are protected against bloodborne pathogens. OSHA has also developed the Personal Protective Equipment Standard, or the PPE. One example of personal protective equipment are vinyl gloves. And in your facility, you'll be asked to wear them when you're giving care to a patient. Another example would be a face mask, or perhaps goggles, depending on what you're doing. Again, all of these things will provide barriers between you and the person you're providing care to. Perhaps you've heard of other caregivers hurting their back while lifting a resident, or being bitten, or something happening while on the job. Well, OSHA's response to this was the Workers' Compensation Act. And the Workers' Compensation Act was enacted so that there were laws against injury and protecting against injury within the workplace. So if that happens, it is your responsibility. If you are injured, it is your responsibility to report this immediately to your supervisor so that the supervisor can follow the procedures for your facility in taking care of this, reporting this information, and managing the situation. Of course, it's to your best interest to make sure that you are working safely. How do you do this? Following the policies and procedures of your workplace. For example, if you fail to use a gate belt, or a coworker of yours fails to use a gate belt, you can imagine the consequences. Someone can become hurt, perhaps you or your coworker. Can you imagine the impact on staffing this has? The best way to keep everybody safe, again, is to follow the policies and procedures. Security is also something that you should be aware of within your facility, and that security systems are set up to protect you and the patient. Perhaps it's frustrating to swipe a card or to punch in a code, but then again, this is done to protect you as well as your resident. So be aware that there are specific procedures, and be sure to ask why if you're not sure around security. They're for your protection. Now, we've talked a little bit about your rights. I also want to talk about the rights